welcome everybody. Thank you for attending. I'm pleased to say that we have some attendees from across Europe. So I will keep the presentation general, and then we can move to country-specific questions in the Q&A. So Bjorn has already introduced me. As you know, I'm a Managing Director of QS and the Wharton MBA. So I've been through the experiences that you're going through in trying to determine what was the right career move and how an MBA can fit within my own personal career path. So I can share some of my personal experiences and also share some of my tips I've learned from admissions officers from all the top business schools around the world over the last 20 years. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some general insight into application trends and admissions trends. We're going to have a couple of polls that Bjorn is going to run, so we get to understand you a little bit better and your interests. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for a Q&A session. So the total length of the program should be about 45 minutes. So initially, I'm going to give you some insight into some market trends from research that QS conducts into the MBA recruitment market and also applicant trends. I'm going to then give you some tips on researching and selecting the right school, and then we'll drill down into the application process. How do you get into the school of your choice? So if we start with market trends, QS has conducted an annual survey since 1990 of MBA employers worldwide. It's the largest sample of MBA employers conducted by any organization in the world. This year we had 1,632 respondents, so it's a very impressive sample. Over a 3-year period we had over 3,500 respondents providing input into our analysis. We also do an applicant survey every year, and we had 5,500 applicants. So our research is very comprehensive and thorough. And the good news is that we are seeing a positive upswing in MBA recruitment demand. So in 2014, we'll see an 8% increase overall in MBA recruiting demand, and employers are projecting an acceleration in growth in 2015 with 12% growth. So it's actually a very healthy MBA employment market. That's not something that you always read about in the press, but actually MBA placement results at business schools this year and for the last couple of years have been extremely positive. And the majority of business schools that we deal with at QS have been reporting between 85 and 95% of their students finding employment within 3 months of graduation. So to some extent, the MBA has become a safe haven in terms of professional qualifications, despite all the turmoil that has affected Europe over the last 5 years. It is also a mature qualification. So we are, based on our employer survey, we expect to see continued growth in the foreseeable future. And that's partly fueled by the vast number of alumni MBAs who are now entering into the recruitment process themselves. So there's a large alumni network that's quite established across Europe today who are themselves active employers. And this graph shows the long-term employment demand for MBAs. So you can see that despite cyclical downturns after the dot-com bust in 2001 and a small dip after the financial crisis in 2000-2008, the MBA has been a remarkably robust qualification. And it's seen overall demand grow steadily in sectors like consulting. We've seen a 6-fold increase in the demand for MBAs in 2014 compared to when we first started doing this research in 1990. It's a phenomenal growth. Why? Well, partly because the MBA has ridden on the back of globalization. As industry has become more global, we've seen that companies around the world have turned to the MBA as a qualification of global repute with global standards, and they have sought to expand their workforce with MBA qualified candidates, whether they're in India, in Latin America, in the UK, Germany, or elsewhere. So it's moved from being a somewhat US and Western European centric qualification in the 80s and 90s to being a global qualification in 2014. So now I'm going to ask Bjorn to conduct a poll. He's going to ask you how many of you want to work in professional services, that's consulting and banking. Just click yes if you want to work in professional services, consulting and banking.
Yeah, thanks, Nunzi. I'm going to ask the question now. I'm going to put the poll live. So for all of you on the screen, you should see now the question coming up right now. I'm going to give you a few seconds to answer this question. So we see the results coming in. Okay, I'm going to stop now the poll. And we have a quite balanced result, I would say. We have 40% saying yes to those sectors of banking and consulting and 60% no. Nunzi, how do you interpret these results?
So that's actually very much in line with the overall MBA population. Roughly 35% of MBAs today are going and working in banking and consulting. So actually our audience is actually very representative. We now have a slide that shows the MBA compensation, and you see that, again, 20 years ago, banking and consulting be the highest paying for MBAs around the world. But today, there are other sectors that have actually leapfrogged the professional services. And that's partly, again, that's driven by this global competition for talent. So companies around the world are looking for high quality candidates, and they realize that they need to compete with banks and consulting firms for that talent. So metals and mining has been a particularly buoyant sector over the last 4 or 5 years, and has very high compensation levels, over $150,000 on average. Energy is also at the top end, as is pharmaceutical and biotech. So those industries are really actively seeking to outbid the consulting sector in reaching that talent pool. And in fact, the average salaries for, and this is salary and bonuses, the average salary and bonus package for banking and consulting today is about $110,000 US starting salary, and for consulting it's about $105,000 US. But you have to remember there's also segmentation within each industry sector. So those are averages, and it includes all the sort of small boutique private equity houses in banking and finance, and all the small boutique consulting firms. So if you're talking about elite firms in those categories, then we know that the elite strategy consulting firms are offering in the region of $130,000 to $140,000 US as their starting packages, and the investment banks, the major investment banks, are offering about $110,000 to $115,000 salaries, but they have much higher bonus packages. So within these averages, you also have quite a wide range. So for those of you who are interested in professional services, I think the salary and compensation horizon is still very attractive, but for the 60% of you who are interested in other sectors, you're actually picking a good time to take an MBA, because global companies are very active. And it's not simply based on the fact that the MBA attracts very high earners who then graduate into these high salaries. So we actually at QS gather data on salary uplift, and you'll see that in Western Europe, the average salary uplift for candidates is about 74%. Now, Asia Pacific has a higher uplift because Asian candidates are coming from lower average salary economies, and often are staying and working in Europe or Western economies afterwards, so they have a very high uplift. For these Western European figures, often candidates are staying and working within the same geography, yet they're still experiencing this high salary uplift. So I think it's a very good indicator of the impact and recognition that the MBA has We can also look at the functions offered to MBAs. And in fact, Western Europe is slightly different. This is overall worldwide, and you see that sales, business development is the #1 function in 2014 and 2013. General management is also popular, finance, other, consulting, followed by marketing, and strategic planning is less popular worldwide. In Western Europe, I can tell you that general management is the most popular function, and strategic planning and consulting are also extremely popular functions, followed by finance, other, and marketing. So slightly different mix for Western Europe. In terms of the experience profile of candidates, I think it's very important to point out that over 50% of candidates sought by employers, 57%, have between 3 and 8 years of work experience. There is a definite preference amongst employers who are recruiting at sort of general leadership scheme level to have candidates in that 3 to 8 years of work experience range. Candidates with less than 1 year's experience actually tend to find jobs which are the same as a master's graduate, and therefore don't experience the same salary improvement, don't have the same benefits. So the MBA, from an employer perspective, is very much a post-experience qualification. In Europe, we actually see a high proportion of demand for candidates with even over 8 years of work experience. So European employers are very positively disposed to candidates with lots of work experience. And just giving a slightly longer term perspective, the pay scale, it's a different organization, have calculated that the net gain, the average compensation over 20 years post-MBA for the MBA graduates in their salary was $2.4 million. They identified MBAs entering almost every industry sector, and they reported a high level of MBAs 10 years after graduation running their own business. So those are expectations you can have longer term. Next, we're going to move to admissions trends, and I think a key message here is that gaining entry to a good business school remains highly competitive. I mean, certainly in the post-2008 financial crisis, business schools were inundated by applications. That has returned to a more normal scenario. So I show a slide for Harvard Business School that dates back to 1954-2000, so you can see that the MBA over that period became much more popular. So you had a ratio of roughly 9 to 1 in terms of applications per place. I can say that in 2014, Harvard Business School is still at an application ratio of roughly 9 to 1, 10 to 1, and that is true for a number of top business schools. Mid-tier business schools tend to be application ratios of about 6 to 1. So it is highly competitive to gain entry, but Western European candidates are highly desirable for most business schools who are seeking diversity. The key thing is that you impress in your application, that you stand out from the crowd, and that you understand why a particular business school is right for your career goals. So the next part of the presentation is hopefully going to give you some real insight into that. In terms of motivations for taking an MBA, from our applicant research, 64% of candidates are seeking to improve career prospects, 61% to learn new skills, 55% to take a leadership position, 50% to build a professional network, 40% take an MBA to achieve a career change. So that is one of the unique features of the MBA qualification. It actually is one of the most effective routes for people who have entered a job post-graduation and they want to make a change and they want to break out of that rut. So whether you are an engineer who wants to move into a management position, or you're a finance professional that wants to move into own a managed business, whatever your career change, I think the MBA has a proven track record in facilitating that. 32% want to start their own business. Now, you don't need to take an MBA to start your own business. I think it's very important to emphasize that only a small proportion of entrepreneurs have an MBA. Nevertheless, for people who want to be fully equipped to be successful in running their own business, an MBA is, I think, a useful starting point. And only 33% say they take an MBA to boost salary. Now, in reality, everyone wants to gain a salary increase of taking an MBA. But I think what this reflects is that people have thought more deeply about their motivations, and that is not the prime driver. And that's important when you recall that you have to apply to these business schools and gain entry. Don't talk about salary gains in your application. It's not what's going to motivate the admissions team. So we're now going to just provide some tips on school selection. And Bjorn, can you do the next poll, which is asking how many of you want to study outside of Europe for your MBA? So just say yes if you want to study outside of Europe. Over to you, Bjorn.
Yeah, I'm going to start the question now. I think for many of you, maybe the US or somewhere is an option, but we will see now how you respond. So I'm starting the question. You should see it now on your screen. So I'm going to give you a few more seconds. Okay, let me close the question now. And we actually have the same result as before. We have again a mixture of 60 and 40%. 60% saying yes, 40% saying no.
Okay, so that's actually unusual. So 60% of you want to work study outside of Europe, and 40% of you want to stay and study in Europe. So actually, we have a much more internationally oriented candidate pool than would be typical. So that's great. I'll try to elaborate for those of you who want to study outside of Europe. So I'm going to basically elaborate on research, I'm going to elaborate on research, on criteria for selection, and on how many schools you should apply to. So we start with research. So the World MBA Tour is your starting point for your research into business school. You're going to have schools from all around the world attending the event, and you will see schools from the US, from Asia Pacific. We will have a couple of schools from Australia, and obviously a selection from across Europe. So it's an opportunity for you, for those of you who are interested in non-EU study, to really gain insight directly from those schools. Even if you're interested in studying in Europe, you might want to speak to schools from other regions just to get a perspective. The World MBA Tour also provides you an opportunity to talk to alumni. The schools often bring alumni, and I think that's a very important perspective. Whichever schools you end up applying to, we always encourage you to meet alumni, speak to them, understand the culture of a school, because you're going to be there for a year, maybe 2 years. You want to make sure you're going to enjoy the experience and that you have a cultural fit. The alumni are the best way to gauge that cultural fit. Beyond the fair and the tour, you also have the opportunity to research the school's websites. It may be after the event that you go away and you do more thorough research, but if you have the chance beforehand, that's also great because it means that you're more informed when you meet the schools at the fair. School websites are very thorough, comprehensive. It's important that you do that research of school websites because you're going to need to show that understanding of what makes a school different when you make your application. And you're also probably going to look at some rankings. I have a general piece of advice for rankings, which is don't take them too seriously. Rankings can be a helpful first observation, but in reality, there are multiple rankings. They all show different results, and the important thing is which school meets your career goals and your objectives. So you have to look at the different criteria in detail and match them to your own priority set. Happy to answer questions later on that. So then we also have criteria for selection. Rankings can influence people, but we argue that you need to look much more deeply. So location, we know that 60% of you want to study outside of Europe. Does location matter? Well, our advice is that if you want to go and work in the US after your MBA, then you probably should study in the US because they're going to provide you with much better career services support, give you much easier access to alumni in that country, and also just the convenience of being able to carry out interviews locally is a big advantage. But the reverse is true. If you know you want to stay and work in Europe after your MBA, then you really ought to consider Europe as a study destination for the same reasons. The pool of alumni, the access to employers is just so much more convenient. So location does matter. Having said that, you want to also look at the placement record. So do the research on the school site, or topmba.com provides you a summary of the salaries on graduation, the percent employed on graduation, which I mentioned earlier, and even some insight into the different kind of industry profiles that graduates take when they complete their MBA. You might want to look at an MBA that specializes in entrepreneurship, for example, if you want to start your own business, in which case on Top MBA we have specialization rankings that show the best business schools for entrepreneurship or finance or marketing based on our employer survey. Teaching method may be important to you. You might want to study the case method. So identifying schools that teach the case method would be important. On the other hand, you may find that where you have to speak in class is somewhat daunting. So other schools are more focused on consultative team-based playing, or they have a more of an academic approach to teaching the MBA. This is all the kind of thing you can learn from your research, from looking at school websites, and you can ask these questions at the World MBA Tour. Finally, the network of alumni. Where are the alumni concentrated? What kind of industries they're working in? How can they help you in achieving your career goals is a really important question and a really important selection criteria. So, okay, you've done your research. You've identified a number of schools that are of interest to you. You've spoken to them at the World MBA Tour. You need to now think about how you apply. How many schools do you apply? I could ask the question, but I'm going to give you the answer. So my advice is that you have a dream school that is one of the elite schools, highly competitive to get into, and you may not gain entry, but it's worth a try. You want to pick a couple of strong schools that are also very competitive, but where you have a slightly higher probability. And finally, you probably want to pick a couple of safety schools that are a little bit less competitive, but you would be very happy to study there. Why? Well, each application is probably going to take you a good 2 or 3 weekends to complete to an adequate standard. That means if you're applying to 5 schools, that's potentially up to 15 weekends of effort that you have to put in for a successful application round. That's on top of your tests and reference letters, etc. It's a major effort. You want to make sure when you've completed this effort that you've gained entry to a suitable school, and you can tell your friends and family that it's been worth it. So that's, I think, sound advice. So now we're going to look at the application process, and in particular the timing and the content. These are tips that we've gained over the years that have largely come from admissions officers themselves. So we hope that you'll find these really useful and they can really make a difference in you getting into the school of your choice. So we're going to talk about when to apply, the different enrolling and admissions rounds. We're also going to talk about the content, and this is made up of 4 elements: your academic profile, your personal profile, your professional profile, and your letters of recommendation. And we treat those 4 areas as of equal importance. They each account probably for about 25% of your chance of gaining admittance, so you need to give each element equal care and attention. So timing. We're already well into the application cycle. Some US schools have already had their first round deadlines. Second round deadlines are going to be in January, and then third round deadlines are in March. Just so you're aware, schools in the US tend to allocate about 40% of their places in the first round, about 40% in the second round, about 20% in the final round. In reality, US schools get about 40% of their applications in the final round in March. That means you, on average, have about only 50% of the chance of gaining an offer if you apply in the final round. So our advice is to apply as early as possible by the second round. Luckily, if you're applying to a European school, they have rolling admissions, which means that they spread their offers evenly through the year. So even if you apply early, it doesn't increase your chances of gaining entry, and it means that even if you apply in May or June, you have an equal probability of gaining entry. That's the difference between rounds and rolling admissions. So now we're going to look at the 4 elements of your application dossier. And remember that I said that we advise that you treat them as equal importance. So if we start with your academic profile. So your academic profile is made up of your GPA from high school and then your standardized tests. If you're a non-native English speaker, then you will probably need to do a TOEFL or IELTS, and most schools will require that you take a GMAT or a GRE. That's not always true for executive MBA programs. I'm not actually presenting here on the difference between executive MBA and the full-time MBA, but I'm happy to answer some questions on that at the end of the presentation if that's of interest to you. So in terms of the GMAT, we will have a presentation at the World MBA Tour with a comprehensive review of the GMAT. There are 4 sections to the GMAT: maths, verbal, writing, and integrated reasoning. I think the main advice I can give you for the GMAT is that you need to prepare. It is not difficult in terms of the nature of the questions, but it's time intensive, and therefore to get a good score you need to have practiced, you need to recognize the questions so that you can move through the exam at pace. So hopefully we can provide you with more insight in our GMAT session at the event. To give you a guidance, there has been inflation in GMAT scores at top schools both in Europe and the US. Stanford is very proud to boast they have a 727. Harvard came in with a 730. Wharton is challenging as well. The reality is that even if you have a 650 or a 680, you have a chance of gaining entry to any business school in the world. Western European candidates have an advantage. You're not as numerous as candidates from some countries. India and Chinese candidates have a disadvantage because they are overrepresented. They have to compete, and therefore a higher GMAT score is more important. Schools have a curve in terms of the profile of nationalities they want, and they try to achieve certain target numbers in general. So for Western European candidates, you probably can gain entry to good schools with a lower GMAT score, but you should always try your best. Your GPA, obviously every country has different GPA recording systems. Schools will be familiar with your rating system, and therefore you can report your scores as they will appear on your transcript. You may want to, in brackets afterwards, put your estimated position in class. So if you're top 10% in the class, you may want to put that in brackets afterwards. It can just help to give it emphasis. On the other hand, if you're bottom 10% in class, we generally advise that you don't emphasize that. That's a joke, but a meaningful piece of advice is you are allowed one weakness. In every admissions dossier, have one weakness, and the admissions officers will tend to look beyond that one weakness, as long as you make up for it with strong elements in all other aspects of your application. So if you didn't do great at university, you can still gain entry to any top business school, and that's proven year after year. Just a final point in terms of the GMAT, it is a computer adaptive test. We'll explain more about this at the World MBA Tour, but everyone starts with an average score of 500. If you get questions right, then your average score drifts up, but so does the severity of the questions. If you're sort of midway into a test and you're finding the questions really easy, that may be a bad sign, because as you get questions wrong, your average score drops, but also the questions become simpler. So the key is to be very attentive in the first phase of each part of the test. Really make sure you get those questions right. and then you can accelerate through the test. So my advice is that if you feel you've got the first 10 or 20 questions wrong in a section, you probably have to give up because there is no recovery from that. But if you're attentive and careful in the first phase, you can then accelerate and still achieve a great score. So next, in terms of content, is your professional profile. This 25% of your chances of success is made up primarily by your essays and the full application dossier. So the first piece of advice is when you submit your application, before you submit it, get a friend or a colleague to proof everything. Make sure that your spellings are correct, the grammar is correct, you haven't omitted anything. If it's an incomplete application, schools may reject you out of hand. If it's riddled with spelling mistakes or linguistic errors, the chances are they will reject you. Schools are looking for reasons not to put you into the approved pool of candidates because they're so oversubscribed. Don't give them an easy reason to reject you. When it comes to essays, I don't have time to give you specific advice on the different essay question types, but the most important message I can give you is that in your essays, first of all, you have to answer the question. Don't cut and paste your answers from other school applications because you will not adapt to the question properly and you'll make mistakes. Start from scratch with each essay. Secondly, keep to the word count. If you carry on over the word count, they may reject you. Thirdly, always make sure that you've answered why this school. Schools, if they're faced with two candidates of equal quality, will pick the candidate they feel is most motivated to go to their school, where their school can provide the best added value in terms of their career objectives, and where the candidate has done the most research. So you need to do a check at the end. Have I answered why I'm motivated to go to this school? It is probably the most important piece of advice I can give you in this lecture. Next, we're looking at your personal profile. Again, 25% of your chance of success. What do I mean by this? Well, schools are looking for diversity. They're looking for candidates who are going to contribute to the overall experience of the other candidates. So here, you need to bring out your personality. And in particular, if you have been heavily involved in extracurricular activities, if you play in an orchestra of a high standard, if you play sports to a competitive standard, if you do volunteer work, raise money for charities, if you run marathons, anything that really defines you as an interesting person needs to appear in your application dossier. It will make you stand out. It will improve your chances of adding to the diversity of the class, and it is really important. It's the thing that most candidates fail to achieve in their application dossier, and it's absolutely the difference between two good candidates, one gaining entry and one not gaining entry. So really think about that when you're completing your dossier. Have I explained what makes me tick as an individual? At the end of the day, the application is from you, it's about you, and the better they have an understanding of what makes you tick, the more chance you have of success. And finally, letters of recommendation. Again, 25% of your chance of success. A lot of candidates every year put together beautiful applications. They may even have a very high test scores, high GPAs, but the letter of recommendation will say, don't admit this candidate, he's a jerk or she's a jerk. Why? Because candidates have underestimated the importance of letters of recommendation. They've just sent out a generic request. So our advice is be carefully about who your recommenders are and actually invest time with them. Take them out for lunch. Explain why going to this business school is really important to your career. Involve them emotionally in your journey.